The moment Navy SEAL Marcus Rodriguez hit the mat with a resounding thud, the entire training facility fell silent. What had started as routine sparring against what everyone assumed was just another beginner had just become the kind of story that would be whispered about in military circles for years to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The petite European woman standing over one of America's most elite warriors wasn't even breathing hard. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Elite Combat Academy, casting long rectangles of golden light across the polished concrete floors. The facility occupied a converted warehouse on the outskirts of San Diego, its industrial bones softened by modern training equipment and the constant rhythm of discipline that defines serious martial arts instruction. The air carried that distinctive mixture of leather, sweat, and the faint antiseptic smell of cleaning supplies that clung to every serious training facility. Heavy bags hung from reinforced ceiling mounts, their surfaces worn smooth by thousands of strikes, while grappling mats spread across the main floor, like a geometric puzzle of blue and red squares. The sound signature was unmistakable, the sharp crack of gloves against pads, the soft thud of bodies hitting mats, and the controlled breathing of athletes pushing their limits under the guidance of instructors who had forgotten more about combat than most people would ever learn. Mirrors lined 3 walls, reflecting the movements of students who ranged from weekend warriors trying to stay in shape to professional fighters, preparing for competitions that would define their careers. This was Tuesday morning at Elite Combat Academy, which meant the intermediate hand-to-hand combat class was in session. The demographic was predictable: off-duty military personnel looking to maintain their edge, law enforcement officers cross-training for street situations, and the occasional civilian who had enough disposable income and dedication to train alongside. People whose jobs required them to be dangerous. The instructor, Dave Martinez, was a former Marine drill instructor whose transition to civilian life had found its perfect expression in teaching combat techniques to people who understood that training wasn't recreation, it was preparation for situations where preparation could mean the difference between going home and being carried home. His voice carried that particular authority that came from years of making life and death decisions under pressure, and his students responded with the kind of focused attention that separated serious training from martial arts tourism. The morning routine was as predictable as military clockwork. 15 minutes of conditioning that would leave most gym-goers questioning their life choices, followed by technique instruction that progressed from basic movements to complex combinations, and concluding with controlled sparring that allowed students to test their skills against partners who wouldn't hesitate to exploit weaknesses or reward sloppy execution. The clientele represented a cross-section of America's warrior culture: active duty Marines from Camp Pendleton, Navy personnel from the nearby base, local police officers, federal agents, and the occasional special operations veteran who had found that civilian life required different skills, but the same mindset that had kept them alive in places most people couldn't find on a map. These were people who understood that combat wasn't about anger or aggression, it was about controlled violence applied with surgical precision when all other options had been exhausted. They trained with the quiet intensity of professionals who knew that the techniques they practiced in this converted warehouse might someday be the difference between completing a mission and becoming a casualty statistic. The facility itself reflected this philosophy. No flashy decorations or motivational posters, just functional equipment maintained to professional standards, and an atmosphere that prioritized results over comfort. The walls were lined with photographs of students who had gone on to successful careers in military and law enforcement, silent testimony to the effectiveness of training that emphasized practical application over theoretical knowledge. As 10 a.m. approached, the regular students began filtering in with the punctuality that marked people whose previous careers had taught them that being late wasn't just disrespectful, it was potentially lethal. They moved with the economical grace of individuals who had learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. Their conversations quiet and purposeful, focused on technique refinement and the kind of tactical discussions that would have sounded like foreign language to civilians. This was the world that Ella Nowakova was about to enter, though nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged in a place where people trained for situations that most individuals hoped they would never encounter. Ella Nowakova stepped through the heavy glass doors of Elite Combat Academy at exactly 10:02 a.m., her arrival so quiet that most of the students didn't notice her until she was already inside the training area. She moved with a deliberate economy of motion that might have been mistaken for nervousness by observers who weren't trained to recognize the difference between anxiety and controlled awareness. At 24, she possessed the kind of understated presence that allowed her to blend into almost any environment without drawing attention to herself. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail secured with an elastic band that had seen better days, and her pale green eyes held a quality of focused attention that suggested she was constantly processing information without appearing to stare at anything in particular. She wore simple black leggings and a fitted gray tank top that revealed arms that were lean rather than muscular, with the kind of functional strength that came from practical application rather than aesthetic development. Her running shoes were worn but well maintained, the kind of practical footwear chosen by someone who understood that equipment was meant to perform rather than impress. The canvas gym bag slung over her shoulder looked like it had accompanied her through multiple moves and various training facilities. The fabric was faded but intact, with reinforced stitching that spoke of quality construction rather than fashion-forward design. She carried it with the unconscious balance of someone who had learned to move efficiently with additional weight, though the bag itself appeared to contain nothing more than the standard collection of training gear that any serious student would bring to class. What set her apart from the other students wasn't any single dramatic characteristic, but rather a collection of subtle details that created an overall impression of someone who was present without needing to announce her presence. Her posture was upright but relaxed, her breathing controlled and steady, and her movements carried the kind of fluid precision that came from years of training in body awareness and spatial orientation. She paused just inside the training area, taking in the layout of the facility with the systematic attention of someone mapping exits and understanding sightlines without appearing to conduct any kind of tactical assessment. Her gaze moved efficiently across the equipment, the other students, and the instructor with the kind of professional observation that categorized and filed information for future reference. The other students, absorbed in their pre-class preparations and conversations, barely registered her arrival. To them, she appeared to be exactly what her registration paperwork claimed, a civilian looking to learn basic self-defense techniques, probably motivated by some combination of fitness goals and personal security concerns that had led her to seek training at a facility known for its practical approach to combat instruction. Her accent, when she had spoken to the receptionist during her initial visit, carried the soft musicality of Eastern Europe, though she had been in the United States long enough for her English to flow with native fluency. She had explained that she was new to the area and interested in learning hand-to-hand combat techniques for personal development and fitness, the kind of explanation that martial arts schools heard regularly from people who had watched too many movies and assumed that a few months of training would transform them into action heroes. The registration process had been routine: liability waivers, emergency contact information, and the standard questions about previous training experience and current fitness level. Her responses had been appropriately modest: some basic fitness background, no formal martial arts training, interest in learning practical self-defense techniques. Nothing in her paperwork or initial presentation suggested that she was anything other than what she appeared to be, another civilian student looking to add some structure and practical skills to her fitness routine. As she found a spot along the wall to set down her bag and begin her pre-class stretching routine, Ella moved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With the kind of methodical preparation that suggested she took training seriously, even if her experience level was presumed to be minimal. Her stretches were thorough and systematic, targeting muscle groups with the precision of someone who understood the importance of proper preparation, though nothing in her routine suggested knowledge that extended beyond what any fitness-conscious individual might have learned from online tutorials or basic gym instruction. The quiet confidence with which she prepared for class might have been interpreted as the nervous determination of someone stepping outside their comfort zone, or simply the focused approach of an individual who approached new challenges with appropriate seriousness. Either way, she blended seamlessly into the pre-class environment, just another student preparing to learn from instructors who had forgotten more about combat than she could hope to absorb in years of training. Dave Martinez clapped his hands twice, the sharp sound cutting through the ambient noise of the training facility like a knife. The response was immediate, and automatic conversations ceased. Movements became purposeful, and 22 students arranged themselves in neat rows facing the instructor with the precision that marked people whose previous careers had taught them that attention to detail wasn't optional. "Morning, warriors," Martinez announced, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had once motivated Marines through training exercises that separated the committed from the curious. "Today we're working on close quarters combat fundamentals, specifically transitioning from striking to grappling when your opponent closes distance on you." The student roster read like a directory of America's military and law enforcement infrastructure. Sergeant Tommy Wilson from the San Diego Police Department stood in the front row, his off-duty civilian clothes unable to disguise the alert posture that came from years of patrol work in neighborhoods where situational awareness was a survival skill. Beside him, Corporal Maria Santos from Camp Pendleton moved through her warm-up routine with the fluid precision of someone who had learned that physical conditioning wasn't vanity, it was operational readiness. Behind them, Special Agent Jake Morrison from the FBI's San Diego field office stretched with the methodical approach of someone whose job occasionally required him to make arrests of individuals who had no intention of cooperating with federal law enforcement. His partner in today's training, Coast Guard Petty Officer Sarah Chun, had driven down from her base in Los Angeles because Elite Combat Academy had a reputation for practical instruction that translated directly to real-world applications. Atmosphere reflected the serious nature of the clientele. These weren't weekend warriors looking for an exciting hobby or civilians trying to replicate action movie sequences. These were professionals who understood that the techniques they learned in this converted warehouse might someday be applied in situations where failure meant more than just losing a sparring match. It meant not going home to their families. Martinez began the class with his standard philosophy briefing, a 5-minute reminder that combat was about problem solving under pressure rather than demonstration of physical dominance. Hand-to-hand combat isn't about being the toughest person in the room, he explained, his eyes scanning the assembled students with the practiced attention of someone who had learned to read people's commitment levels through their body language. It's about being the most prepared person in the room, when preparation becomes the difference between mission success and mission failure. The warm-up routine reflected this practical philosophy. 15 minutes of exercises that targeted the specific muscle groups and movement patterns required for close-quarters combat. Explosive movements that developed the kind of functional strength needed to control an opponent's center of gravity. Flexibility drills that ensured full range of motion under stress. And cardiovascular conditioning that would allow students to maintain technical precision even when adrenaline and physical exertion began to compromise their fine motor skills. Ella followed the warm-up routine with the focused attention of someone genuinely learning new movements, though her execution was smooth enough to suggest a solid fitness foundation. She asked appropriate questions during technique demonstrations, queries about foot positioning and weight distribution that indicated she was taking the instruction seriously without revealing any advanced knowledge that might contradict her beginner status. The other students barely noticed her during this phase of the class. Their attention was focused on Martinez's demonstrations and their own technique refinement, the kind of self-directed learning that characterized people who understood that training time was valuable and shouldn't be wasted on social interaction or ego management. Today's scenario, Martinez announced as the warm-up concluded, is simple but critical. Your opponent has closed distance and neutralized your ability to maintain striking range. Maybe you're in a confined space, maybe they've gotten inside your reach, maybe environmental factors have eliminated your mobility options. The question becomes, how do you transition from defensive positioning to offensive control when the tactical situation changes faster than your training partner's bank account after a weekend in Vegas? The comment drew chuckles from students who recognized the instructor's tendency to use humor as a teaching tool, but the underlying message was serious. Combat situations evolved rapidly, and the ability to adapt techniques to changing circumstances was what separated effective fighters from people who knew impressive-looking moves that only worked under ideal conditions. Martinez divided the class into pairs for the first drilling sequence. Basic escape techniques when an opponent achieved close quarters positioning. The matchups were based on size and experience level, with newer students paired with partners who could provide appropriate resistance without overwhelming them during the learning phase. Nowakova, Martinez called out, consulting his roster. You're with Rodriguez. He'll go easy on you while you're learning the fundamentals. Navy SEAL Marcus Rodriguez looked up from his equipment check with the expression of someone who had just been assigned babysitting duty during what was supposed to be serious training time. At 32, he carried himself with the controlled confidence that came from surviving multiple deployments in places where the margin for error was measured in milliseconds, and his reputation at Elite Combat Academy was built on a foundation of technical precision that made him a favorite sparring partner for students who wanted to test their skills against someone who fought like their life depended on it. Rodriguez had been coming to Elite Combat Academy for 8 months ever since returning from his latest deployment to a classified location that had required skill sets that weren't covered in standard SEAL training. His approach to civilian training was the same systematic methodology that had kept him alive in hostile territory, constant improvement through realistic practice against opponents who wouldn't hesitate to exploit weaknesses or reward sloppy technique. He glanced across the mat at Ella, taking in her beginner-appropriate workout clothes and the nervous energy that he interpreted as typical new student anxiety. In his experience, civilian students fell into predictable categories: those who watched too many movies and expected to become lethal weapons after a few classes, those who approached training with appropriate humility and made steady progress, and those who discovered that real combat training was significantly more demanding than their fitness routines had prepared them for. "Great," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for nearby students to hear. "Looks like I'm playing training dummy for someone who probably thinks martial arts is like what she's seen in Hollywood movies." Corporal Santos, stretching nearby, caught his comment and grinned. "Come on, Rodriguez. Remember when you were new here? Martinez paired you with Thompson for your first month, and you spent most of that time getting educated about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application." Rodriguez's expression suggested that he remembered those early training sessions with less fondness than Santos implied. "That was different. I came in with operational experience and a foundation in close-quarters combat. This is babysitting duty. The comment carried just far enough for Ella to hear, though her expression remained neutral as she finished adjusting her gear. She had encountered this attitude before, the assumption that her appearance and presumed background made her unsuitable for serious training, that her presence would somehow diminish the quality of instruction or waste time that could be better spent on students who looked like they belonged in a facility dedicated to preparing people for violent encounters. Martinez, observing the interaction from across the training area, recognized the dynamic that was developing. He had seen it before, experienced students who resented being paired with newcomers, particularly when those newcomers didn't fit their preconceptions about what serious martial artists should look like. It was a teaching opportunity disguised as a potential problem, and his approach would determine whether the class learned something valuable about assumptions and respect, or simply reinforced existing prejudices about who belonged in combat training. Rodriguez, Martinez called out, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was about to deliver a lesson that extended beyond physical techniques. I'm sure you remember what it was like to be new somewhere. Maybe you can share some of that wisdom while you're helping Ms. Nawakova learn the basics. The instructor's comment was delivered with the kind of diplomatic authority that suggested it wasn't really a request, but Rodriguez's body language indicated that he interpreted the assignment as punishment rather than opportunity. He walked across the mat toward Ella with the resigned stride of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than embracing a chance to contribute to another person's development. "All right," he said, his tone carrying the patronizing patience that adults used when explaining simple concepts to children. "We're going to start with basic escape techniques. The scenario is that I've gotten close enough to limit your mobility, and you need to create distance so you can either strike or disengage completely." Ella nodded, her expression attentive but unremarkable. Should I be trying to actually escape or just practicing the movements? The question seemed to confirm Rodriguez's assumptions about her experience level. "Let's start with just learning the mechanics. I'll apply light pressure so you can feel what the technique is supposed to accomplish, but don't worry about actually making it work against resistance. That comes later, after you've developed some foundation." Other students had begun their own drilling, and the sound of controlled combat filled the training area. The soft impact of bodies moving on mats, the sharp exhalations that accompanied explosive movements, and the quiet coaching that passed between partners who understood that effective learning required immediate feedback on technique execution. Rodriguez demonstrated the escape sequence that Martinez had shown during the instructional phase. A combination of hip movement, hand positioning, and leverage that would theoretically allow a smaller person to create distance from a larger opponent who had achieved close quarters control. His explanation was technically accurate, but delivered with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions rather than sharing knowledge with genuine enthusiasm. "The key," he explained, moving through the technique at quarter speed, "is timing and leverage rather than strength. You're not trying to overpower your opponent, you're trying to redirect their energy and create space for counterattack or disengagement." Ella watched the demonstration with focused attention, asking clarifying questions about hand placement and timing that suggested she was taking the instructions seriously. Her questions were appropriate for someone learning the technique for the first time, though they demonstrated a level of body awareness that might have been notable if Rodriguez had been paying attention to anything other than his own frustration with the assignment. "Ready to try it?" he asked, positioning himself in the demonstration stance that would allow her to practice the escape sequence without encountering realistic resistance. Ella's first attempts at the escape technique were executed with the careful precision of someone genuinely learning new movements, though her body mechanics were surprisingly sound for someone who claimed minimal training experience. Rodriguez, however, was more focused on his own internal frustration than on observing the subtle indicators that might have suggested his partner's background. was more complex than her registration paperwork indicated. "Not bad for a beginner," he said after her third repetition, his tone carrying the condescending approval that teachers might use when praising a child's crayon drawing. "Your timing needs work, and you're not generating enough hip rotation, but that's normal for someone just starting out." The other students continued their drilling around them, their training partnerships characterized by the mutual respect that came from shared understanding of the challenges involved in mastering combat techniques. Sergeant Wilson worked with Agent Morrison, their practice sessions marked by the kind of constructive feedback that helped both partners improve their execution. Corporal Santos partnered with Petty Officer Chun, their drilling characterized by the professional courtesy that marked people who understood that effective training required both participants to contribute to the learning process. Rodriguez's approach with Ella, however, was markedly different. His corrections were delivered with increasing impatience, and his demonstrations carried the exaggerated slowness that adults use when they suspected their audience wasn't capable of understanding complex information. "Let me show you again," he said after Ella's fifth repetition, which had been technically correct, but apparently not executed with the decisiveness that Rodriguez expected from more experienced students. "You need to commit to the movement. Right now you're practicing it like a dance routine instead of like something you might actually need to use if someone was trying to hurt you." Martinez circulated among the training pairs, offering corrections and encouragement as students worked through the technical challenges of the escape sequence. When he reached Rodriguez and Ella, he observed their interaction for several minutes, noting the dynamic that had developed between the experienced SEAL and the newcomer who was absorbing his condescending instruction without complaint. "How's it going over here?" Martinez asked, his tone neutral, but his expression suggesting that he was paying attention to more than just technical execution. "She's learning," Rodriguez replied, his words technically accurate but delivered with the kind of forced patience that suggested he was performing a duty rather than sharing knowledge. "Basic beginner mistakes, timing, commitment, understanding of distance and leverage. Nothing that won't improve with practice." Martinez watched Ella execute the technique one more time, noting details that Rodriguez had apparently missed. The precision of her foot placement, the economy of her movements, and the controlled breathing that suggested familiarity with stress management under physical pressure. Her execution was improving with each repetition, but more interesting was the way she processed feedback and made adjustments without the trial and error approach that typically characterized genuinely new students. "Ms. Nowakova," Martinez said, addressing her directly, "how does the technique feel? Are you getting the leverage point that we discussed during the demonstration?" Ella paused, considering her response with the thoughtfulness of someone who took instruction seriously. "I think I understand the principle, but I'm not sure if I'm executing it correctly. It feels like I should be generating more power from the rotation, but I don't want to use too much force during practice." The answer demonstrated an understanding of training methodology that went beyond what most beginners possessed. But Rodriguez interpreted her hesitation as confirmation of his assumptions about her experience level. "That's the problem with beginners," he said to Martinez, speaking about Ella as if she weren't standing right beside them. "They overthink everything instead of just committing to the movement. In a real situation, hesitation gets you hurt." Other students had begun to notice the dynamic developing between Rodriguez and his training partner. Corporal Santos paused in her own drilling to observe the interaction, her expression suggesting that she was witnessing something that made her uncomfortable. The respectful atmosphere that typically characterized elite combat academies' training environment was being undermined by one student's assumption that his experience gave him license to treat a newcomer with casual disrespect. "Maybe," Martinez said carefully, "Ms. Nowakova would benefit from working with a partner who's more focused on helping her learn than on demonstrating how much more advanced his own skills are." Rodriguez's expression shifted to defensive annoyance. "I'm trying to help her. But you can't teach someone who doesn't have the foundation to understand what they're learning. Maybe she should start with a basic fitness class before jumping into combat training. The comment carried far enough for nearby students to hear, and several of them glanced over with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to disapproving. Elite Combat Academy had built its reputation on fostering an environment where students could learn and improve regardless of their starting point, and Rodriguez's attitude was contradicting the facility's core values. Ella's response to this escalating disrespect was notable for what it didn't include. No defensive explanations, no emotional reactions, no attempts to justify her presence in the class. She simply stood there absorbing Rodriguez's criticism with the same controlled composure she had maintained throughout the interaction, her breathing steady and her posture relaxed despite the increasingly hostile environment. "I understand if my inexperience is making the training less effective for you," she said quietly, her accent adding a musical quality to words that carried no trace of anger or frustration. "Perhaps I should work with a different partner so you can focus on more advanced techniques." The offer was delivered with such genuine courtesy that it made Rodriguez's behavior appear even more unreasonable by contrast. Here was someone who was willing to subordinate her own learning needs to avoid interfering with his training, and his response was to double down on the assumption that her presence was inherently problematic. "It's not just about effectiveness," Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying the kind of authority that he was accustomed to having go unquestioned. "It's about safety. Beginners who don't understand their limitations can get hurt, and they can hurt other people. Maybe you should observe for a few weeks before actually participating in the drilling." The comment about observing instead of participating carried across the training area with the clarity of a bell, causing conversations to pause and heads to turn toward the source of the disruption. In a facility where respect for fellow students was considered as fundamental as proper technique execution, Rodriguez's suggestion that Ella was too inexperienced to participate safely represented a violation of the community standards that made Elite Combat Academy function as more than just a collection of individuals pursuing separate training goals. Martinez stepped forward, his instructor's instincts recognizing that the situation had evolved beyond a simple personality conflict between training partners. The other students were now paying attention, and their response to how this situation was handled would influence the training environment for weeks to come. "Rodriguez," Martinez said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that had once been used to manage Marines under combat stress, "I think you might be confusing your role here. You're a student, not an instructor, and your job is to help your partner learn, not to determine who belongs in my class." But Rodriguez had committed to his position and seemed determined to defend it publicly. "Look, I'm not trying to be difficult, but we're working on techniques that require a certain level of foundation. If someone doesn't have that foundation, they're not going to be able to execute effectively, and that creates problems for everyone." He gestured toward Ella with the kind of dismissive authority that suggested he was stating obvious facts rather than expressing personal opinions. "She's hesitant, she's overthinking every movement, and she's not generating the kind of explosive power that these techniques require. In a real situation, that hesitation would get her hurt." The other students had stopped their own drilling entirely now, drawn by the unusual spectacle of someone publicly questioning another student's right to participate in training. Sergeant Wilson exchanged glances with Agent Morrison, both men uncomfortable with the direction the interaction had taken. Corporal Santos moved closer to the developing situation, her expression suggesting that she was preparing to intervene if necessary. "Maybe," Rodriguez continued, his voice gaining confidence from what he interpreted as the attention of his audience, "she should start with some basic fitness classes or women's self-defense programs before jumping into advanced combat training. There's no shame in building a foundation before trying to run with the experienced students." The suggestion was delivered with the kind of patronizing reasonableness that made it sound like helpful advice rather than thinly veiled exclusion. But its impact on the assembled students was immediate and negative. These were people who had earned their place in elite combat academy through dedication and skill development, and they recognized that Rodriguez was attempting to deny someone else the same opportunity based on assumptions about her appearance and presumed background. Ella's response to this public dismissal was remarkable for its restraint. She didn't defend her qualifications, didn't challenge Rodriguez's assessment, didn't appeal to Martinez for support or validation. Instead, she stood quietly absorbing the criticism with the same controlled composure that had characterized her behavior throughout the interaction, her breathing steady and her posture relaxed despite being the target of increasingly aggressive dismissal. "I appreciate your concern for safety," she said finally, her voice carrying the same musical accent that had characterized her earlier responses, but with an undertone of something that careful observers might have recognized as controlled patience rather than submission. "Perhaps you're right that I should observe more before participating." The gracious acceptance of Rodriguez's criticism made his behavior appear even more unreasonable by contrast, and several students shifted uncomfortably as they witnessed someone accepting humiliation with dignity while her antagonist pressed his advantage. "It's not personal," Rodriguez said, apparently interpreting her response as validation of his position. "It's just practical. Combat training isn't like regular fitness classes where you can fake your way through if you don't understand what you're doing. People get hurt when students don't respect the seriousness of what we're learning here." Martinez had heard enough. As the instructor responsible for maintaining the training environment, he recognized that Rodriguez's behavior was not only unfair to Ella, but was also undermining the mutual respect that made effective learning possible for all students. "That's interesting, Rodriguez," Martinez said, his tone carrying the kind of deceptive calm that experienced military personnel learn to recognize as a warning sign. "Since you're so concerned about safety and proper foundations, maybe you'd be willing to demonstrate the techniques we've been working on." Rodriguez nodded confidently, apparently missing the subtle shift in Martinez's demeanor. "Of course. I think it would be educational for everyone to see what proper execution looks like." "Excellent," Martinez replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "But instead of demonstrating against a compliant partner, let's see how well you execute these techniques against someone who's providing realistic resistance." He turned to address the assembled students, his voice carrying the authority of someone making an important teaching point. "Sometimes the best way to learn about assumptions is to test them against reality. Rodriguez has expressed concerns about Ms. Nawakova's ability to participate safely in our training, so let's give him an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of advanced skills that he believes are necessary for effective participation." The other students recognized that something significant was about to happen, though none of them understood exactly what Martinez was planning. They formed a loose circle around the training area, their attention focused on what promised to be either an educational demonstration or a humbling lesson in the dangers of making assumptions about fellow students. "Ms. Nawakova," Martinez said, turning to address Ella directly, "would you be willing to help Rodriguez demonstrate proper technique execution? Nothing too advanced, just basic sparring to show everyone what realistic resistance looks like." Ella looked at Martinez for a long moment, her pale green eyes holding a conversation that the other students couldn't quite interpret. Then she nodded once, a small movement that somehow conveyed more significance than a longer response would have carried. Martinez stepped back to give the demonstration pair adequate space, but his positioning allowed him to observe both participants with the focused attention of someone who suspected that the next few minutes would provide educational value that extended far beyond technical instruction. The other students arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around the training area, their conversations reduced to whispers as they sensed that something significant was about to unfold. Rodriguez moved to the center of the mat with the confident stride of someone who had never questioned his own capabilities or worried about the outcome of any training scenario. His reputation at Elite Combat Academy was built on a foundation of technical precision and competitive success that had made him the measuring stick against which other students evaluated their own progress. He had sparred with federal agents, police officers, and military personnel from every branch of service, and his record of wins against opponents who ranged from weekend warriors to special operations veterans had reinforced his conviction that experience and training were immediately apparent in physical confrontation. "Basic sparring rules," Martinez announced to the assembled students, his voice carrying the authority of someone establishing parameters for what promised to be an important lesson. "Light to moderate contact, no strikes to the face or throat. Tap out when you're caught in a submission hold. The objective is demonstrating technique execution under realistic pressure, not proving who's tougher." He looked directly at Rodriguez, his expression carrying a warning that the SEL either missed or chose to ignore. "Remember, this is about education, not ego. Show everyone what proper technique looks like when both participants are fully committed to the exercise." Rodriguez nodded confidently, interpreting the instructor's comments as standard safety briefing, rather than specific guidance about his attitude toward the demonstration. He had participated in hundreds of similar exercises throughout his military career and civilian training, and his approach was characterized by the systematic methodology that had served him well in environments where technical precision was the difference between mission success and casualty reports. "Ready when you are," he said to Ella, his tone carrying the patronizing patience of someone who expected to provide a gentle but educational lesson about the realities of combat training. "I'll start with light pressure so you can get comfortable with the contact, then gradually increase the intensity as you adjust to the sparring environment." Ella's response was to simply nod and assume a basic fighting stance that appeared unremarkable to most observers. Her feet were positioned shoulder-width apart, her hands raised in a guard position that looked like something she might have learned from online tutorials or basic self-defense classes. Her breathing remained controlled and steady, and her expression carried the focused attention of someone preparing to learn from an experience that would likely be humbling but educational. What the assembled students didn't notice, but Martinez observed with growing interest, was the subtle shift in Ella's entire presence as she prepared for the sparring session. The nervous energy that had characterized her earlier interactions with Rodriguez had been replaced by something that was harder to define, a quality of controlled readiness that suggested she was more comfortable with physical confrontation than her beginner status would indicate. Rodriguez began the sparring session with the kind of controlled aggression that experienced fighters used when working with less skilled partners. His movements were technically sound, but deliberately limited in speed and power, designed to provide realistic pressure without overwhelming someone who was presumably learning to deal with physical confrontation for the first time. His first attack was a basic combination, a jab followed by a cross, both delivered at approximately half power and designed to test Ella's defensive reflexes while giving her an opportunity to practice the blocking techniques that Martinez had demonstrated. During the instructional phase of class, Rodriguez expected her to absorb the strikes on her forearms, possibly stumble backward from the unfamiliar pressure, and require coaching about maintaining her balance under the stress of incoming attacks. Instead, Ella's response was so fluid and immediate that Rodriguez almost missed it entirely. Rather than backing away or attempting to block the strikes, she moved forward and slightly to the side, closing the distance between them while simultaneously deflecting his lead hand with a movement so economical that it appeared almost casual. The deflection redirected Rodriguez's momentum while positioning her inside his reach, where his longer limbs became disadvantages rather than assets. Before Rodriguez could adjust to the unexpected change in distance and positioning, Ella had placed her left hand on his shoulder and her right hand on his extended arm. establishing control points that allowed her to manipulate his balance and posture with minimal effort. The movement was executed with such speed and precision that most of the watching students weren't sure exactly what they had witnessed, only that the expected dynamic of the sparring session had somehow been reversed. Rodriguez found himself off balance and unable to generate effective power for follow-up strikes, his technical advantages neutralized by positioning that he hadn't anticipated and couldn't immediately counter. His training had prepared him for opponents who would fight at the distance and rhythm that his size and experience made most advantageous. But Ella had eliminated those advantages with movements that suggested familiarity with close quarters, combat that extended far beyond anything a beginner should possess. "Interesting," Martinez murmured, his comment carrying just far enough for the nearest students to hear. "Ms. Nowakova seems to have some natural aptitude for distance management." Rodriguez attempted to regain his advantage by using his superior size and strength to create separation, but Ella's response demonstrated technical knowledge that went far beyond anything a recreational student should have possessed. As he pushed backward to create striking distance, she maintained contact with his lead arm while simultaneously stepping through his center line, a movement that kept her positioned where his reach advantages were neutralized while maintaining her ability to control his balance and momentum. The watching students began to recognize that something unusual was happening, though most of them lacked the technical knowledge to understand exactly what they were witnessing. Sergeant Wilson leaned toward Agent Morrison, his expression puzzled. "Is it just me, or does she seem to know exactly what she's doing?" Rodriguez, now frustrated by his inability to establish the dominant position that his experience and physical advantages should have guaranteed, increased the intensity of his attacks. His strikes became faster and more powerful, delivered with the kind of focused aggression that had served him well in training scenarios, against opponents who fought in predictable patterns using techniques that his military instruction had prepared him to counter. But Ella's responses continued to defy his expectations. Rather than backing away from the increased pressure or making the defensive mistakes that inexperienced fighters typically made when overwhelmed, she moved closer to Rodriguez, using his own forward momentum to assist in throwing techniques that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Her movements flowed together with a continuity that suggested years of training in systems that emphasized efficiency over flashy technique and practical application over theoretical knowledge. Within 30 seconds of the sparring sessions beginning, Rodriguez found himself on the ground for the first time, the victim of a hip throw that had used his own aggressive forward movement against him. The technique was executed with such speed and precision that he barely understood how he had ended up on his back, staring up at Ella, who remained standing in a balanced position that suggested she was completely prepared for whatever came next. "How did Bull quotes Rodriguez began, his question trailing off as he processed the implications of what had just happened. He rolled backward and regained his feet, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion as he realized that his assumptions about his training partner had been fundamentally incorrect. Martinez stepped forward, his role as instructor requiring him to ensure that the demonstration remained educational rather than becoming a display of personal dominance. "Everything okay, Rodriguez? Do you need a moment to reset, or are you ready to continue the demonstration?" The question was delivered with neutral professionalism, but the assembled students recognized that something significant had shifted in the dynamic between the sparring partners. Rodriguez's confident demeanor had been replaced by the focused attention of someone who realized he was facing an opponent whose capabilities he had seriously underestimated. "I'm fine," Rodriguez replied, though his tone carried none of the casual authority that had characterized his earlier comments about Ella's suitability for advanced training. "Just surprised by her technique. It's more advanced than I expected." Ella remained in her ready position, her breathing still controlled and steady, despite having just executed a complex throwing technique against a larger, stronger opponent. Her expression carried the same focused attention that had characterized her behavior throughout the class. But there was something in her pale, green eyes that suggested she was operating at a level of tactical awareness that extended far beyond recreational martial arts training. "Should we continue?" she asked quietly, her accented voice carrying no trace of triumph or satisfaction at having successfully thrown a Navy SEAL. The question was delivered with the same courtesy that had characterized her earlier responses. To Rodriguez's criticism, as if nothing unusual had happened, Rodriguez nodded, his commitment to the demonstration now motivated by the need to understand what he was dealing with rather than by confidence in his ability to provide a gentle educational experience for a presumed beginner. His second approach was more cautious, characterized by the kind of systematic testing that experienced fighters used when facing unfamiliar opponents, whose capabilities were difficult to assess, but caution didn't help him any more than aggression had. Ella's responses to his more measured attacks demonstrated technical knowledge that seemed to encompass multiple fighting systems, integrated into a flowing style that adapted seamlessly to whatever he attempted. When he tried to establish grappling control, she countered with joint locks that appeared from angles he hadn't expected. When he attempted to maintain striking distance, she closed the gap with footwork that positioned her where his techniques were least effective. While her responses had maximum impact, the watching students were no longer whispering among themselves. The training area had fallen silent, except for the sounds of the sparring session, controlled breathing, the soft impact of feet moving on mats, and the occasional sharp exhalation that accompanied explosive movements. Everyone present recognized that they were witnessing something that transcended the normal boundaries of training exercises. Corporal Santos found herself holding her breath as she watched Ella flow through defensive sequences that neutralized Rodriguez's attacks while setting up counterattacks that demonstrated precision and timing that should have required years of advanced training to develop. "That's not beginner technique," she whispered to Petty Officer Chun. "That's professional-level skill." Martinez circulated around the sparring pair, his instructor's eye cataloging details that confirmed his growing suspicions about Ella's background. Her movement pattern suggested training in multiple disciplines, integrated into a personal fighting style that prioritized efficiency and practical application over adherence to any single system's methodology. Her breathing remained controlled under pressure, her balance was maintained throughout complex sequences, and her tactical decision-making demonstrated the kind of combat experience that couldn't be gained through recreational training. After 2 minutes of sparring that had systematically dismantled every assumption Rodriguez had made about his opponent's capabilities, Martinez called for a pause. "That's enough for demonstration purposes," he announced, though his tone suggested that the educational value of what they had witnessed was still being processed by everyone present. Rodriguez stood in the center of the mat, his chest rising and falling with the controlled breathing of someone who had been working significantly harder than he had expected. His expression carried this stunned recognition of someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally altered by evidence that contradicted everything he thought he knew about the situation. "Ms. Nowakova," Martinez said, his voice carrying a new note of respect that hadn't been present during her earlier interactions with the class. "That was quite impressive. Perhaps you have more training background than your registration paperwork indicated." The silence that followed Martinez's question stretched across the training area like a physical presence, broken only by the sound of Rodriguez's controlled breathing as he processed what had just happened to his assumptions about combat training and the people who pursued it. The other students remained frozen in their observation positions, their expressions reflecting various stages of recognition that they had just witnessed something that challenged their understanding of what advanced martial arts skills looked like. Rodriguez looked at Ella with the expression of someone trying to reconcile observable evidence with preconceived notions that had just been demolished by reality. "I don't understand," he said finally. his voice carrying none of the confident authority that had characterized his earlier dismissal of her capabilities. Your technique. That wasn't beginner-level execution. Those were advanced combinations, professional quality timing. Ella's response was to simply nod once, the same small movement that had characterized her earlier interactions, but now it carried implications that made everyone present reconsider what they thought they knew about quiet confidence and understated competence. Sometimes, she said quietly, her accented voice carrying a quality of controlled patience, people learn different things in different places. Not all training happens in facilities that look like this one. The comment was delivered without defensiveness or triumph, but it carried enough weight to make several students exchange glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that their assumptions about who belonged in advanced combat training might have been more limited than they had realized. Martinez stepped forward, his instructor's instincts recognizing that the demonstration had provided educational value that extended far beyond technical instruction. Rodriguez, he said, his tone carrying the kind of measured authority that suggested an important teaching moment was about to be delivered. What did you learn from this sparring session? Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his expression reflecting the kind of internal processing that happened when strongly held beliefs encountered contradictory evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I learned, he said finally, that my assumptions about her experience level were wrong, completely wrong. He looked directly at Ella, his expression carrying the uncomfortable recognition of someone who realized that his behavior had been based on prejudices rather than accurate assessment. I also learned that I made judgments about her capabilities based on her appearance and presumed background, instead of giving her the respect that anyone walking into this facility deserves. The admission was delivered with the kind of reluctant honesty that marked people who had been forced to confront their own mistakes in public, but it carried enough genuine recognition to suggest that the lesson had been absorbed rather than simply acknowledged for social convenience. Sergeant Wilson stepped forward from his position among the observing students, his expression thoughtful. Ms. Nowakova, he said, I apologize for not speaking up earlier when Rodriguez was dismissing your right to participate in training. I should have recognized that everyone who shows up here deserves respect until they prove otherwise, not the other way around. The apology triggered a series of similar acknowledgments from other students who realized that their silence during Rodriguez's earlier criticism had contributed to an environment where someone's dignity had been undermined by assumptions that had no basis in reality. Agent Morrison nodded toward Ella with the kind of professional respect that law enforcement officers reserved for people whose capabilities they had underestimated to their own detriment. I've been training here for 6 months, Morrison said, and I've never seen technique execution like what you just demonstrated. Whatever your background is, you've earned the right to be here through skill rather than through paperwork or registration fees. Corporal Santos moved closer to the group, her expression carrying the kind of professional curiosity that marked people who recognized advanced skills when they encountered them. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, where did you develop that level of technical proficiency? I've trained with special operations personnel who didn't demonstrate that kind of integrated system knowledge. Ella's response was to glance toward Martinez, a small interaction that suggested she was seeking guidance about how much information she should share with people who had just witnessed capabilities that probably weren't supposed to be displayed. In civilian training environments, Martinez recognized the look and understood its implications. As someone who had spent years working with military personnel whose backgrounds included classified training and operational experience, he had learned to recognize the subtle indicators that suggested a student's capabilities extended beyond what their official documentation revealed. Sometimes, Martinez said carefully, addressing the assembled students rather than answering Santos's question directly, the most important lesson we can learn is that respect should be our starting point with everyone we encounter, not something we withhold until people prove they deserve it. He gestured toward Rodriguez, who was still processing the implications of what had just happened to his assumptions about training partners and combat capabilities. Rodriguez made the mistake of assuming that someone's appearance or presumed background told him everything he needed to know about their abilities. The rest of us made the mistake of allowing that assumption to create an environment where someone was treated with disrespect instead of the courtesy that should be automatic. The comment carried across the training area with the weight of an official policy statement, and several students nodded with the recognition that the lesson extended beyond martial arts technique into broader questions about how they approached interactions with people whose backgrounds they didn't fully understand. Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression carrying the kind of uncomfortable determination that marked people who realized they needed to make amends for behavior they couldn't defend. "Ms. Nowakova," he said, "I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you recognition that my behavior was unprofessional and disrespectful, and that it had nothing to do with legitimate safety concerns and everything to do with my own assumptions about who belongs in advanced training." He paused, looking around at the other students who were witnessing his acknowledgement of error. "I also owe everyone here an apology for creating an environment where someone's dignity was undermined instead of protected. That's not what Elite Combat Academy represents, and it's not what I want to represent as a student here." The admission was delivered with enough genuine recognition to suggest that Rodriguez understood the broader implications of what had happened, though the full scope of his mistake wouldn't become clear until he learned more about exactly who he had been dismissing as unsuitable for serious combat training. After the class concluded and most students had departed, Martinez approached Ella as she gathered her equipment with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized her behavior throughout the session. The training facility had returned to its normal post-class quiet, but the atmosphere still carried traces of the tension and revelation that had marked the day's most significant lesson. "Ms. Nowakova," Martinez said, his voice carrying the kind of professional curiosity that marked instructors who recognized when they had encountered something outside their normal experience. "Would you mind staying for a few minutes? I'd like to discuss your training background and how we might better accommodate your skill level in future classes." Ella paused in her equipment organization, her pale green eyes meeting Martinez's gaze with the kind of direct attention that suggested she had been expecting this conversation. "Of course. Though I should mention that my background might be more complicated than what typically appears on student registration forms." Martinez nodded, having suspected as much from the moment he witnessed her technical execution during the sparring demonstration. "I've worked with enough military and law enforcement personnel to recognize when someone's capabilities extend beyond recreational training. Your movement patterns and tactical decision-making suggest professional-level instruction." They moved to Martinez's office, a small space adjacent to the main training area that served as both administrative center and private meeting room for conversations that required discretion. The walls were lined with photographs of students who had gone on to successful careers in various branches of military and law enforcement service, silent testimony to the facility's reputation for preparing people for demanding professional applications. "Before we discuss specifics," Martinez said as they settled into chairs positioned across from his desk, "I want to apologize for not intervening earlier in Rodriguez's behavior. I suspected there was more to your background than what appeared on your paperwork, but I allowed the situation to develop beyond what should have been acceptable." Ella's response was the same controlled courtesy that had characterized her earlier interactions. "You provided an educational opportunity that benefited everyone involved. Sometimes people need to experience the consequences of their assumptions before they can recognize why those assumptions are problematic." Martinez studied her expression, noting the kind of tactical awareness that suggested her training had included situations where reading people's intentions and capabilities was a survival skill rather than a social convenience. Your technique. Integration suggests training in multiple systems. Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, perhaps some Eastern European combat methods. That's not the kind of background someone develops through recreational classes. Ella was quiet for a moment, considering how much information she should share with someone who had demonstrated professional discretion, but whose security clearance and need to know status were unknown factors in an equation that involved operational security considerations. I grew up in Czech Republic, she said finally. My father was military, my mother worked in government security. Physical training was part of family routine rather than recreational activity. When I was 18, I was recruited for specialized instruction that prepared people for situations that required capabilities beyond what conventional military training provided. Martinez recognized the careful phrasing that people used when discussing backgrounds that involved classified activities or sensitive government work. His own military experience had taught him to read between the lines when someone described training that couldn't be detailed without violating security protocols. Specialized instruction, he repeated. The kind that would explain why you move like someone who has applied these techniques in operational environments rather than just training scenarios. Ella nodded once. The kind that prepares people for situations where technical precision isn't just about winning competitions or passing tests. Sometimes it's about completing missions that require capabilities that can't be developed through traditional training methods. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Martinez looked up to see Rodriguez standing in the doorway, his expression carrying the uncomfortable determination of someone who had realized he needed to make amends for behavior that had extended beyond simple training disagreements. "Excuse me," Rodriguez said. "I know you're having a private conversation, but I wanted to speak with Ms. Nowakova before she left, if that's appropriate." Martinez looked to Ella, who nodded permission for Rodriguez to join the conversation. The Navy SEAL entered the office and took a seat, his posture carrying none of the confident authority that had characterized his earlier interactions. "Ms. Nowakova," Rodriguez began, "I've spent the last hour thinking about what happened during our sparring session, and I've realized that my behavior was worse than just disrespectful. It was unprofessional and based on assumptions that had no basis in reality." He paused, his expression reflecting the kind of internal processing that happened when people confronted the gap between their self-perception and their actual behavior. "I also realized that I made those assumptions despite my own training in the importance of accurate threat assessment and situational awareness. I should have recognized that someone who carried themselves the way you do had training that I wasn't qualified to evaluate." Ella listened to this admission without interrupting, her expression remaining neutral as Rodriguez worked through his recognition of error. "I want to ask," Rodriguez continued, "if you would be willing to tell me about your background. Not because I think I'm entitled to that information, but because I want to understand how badly I misjudged the situation and what I can learn from this mistake." Martinez leaned back in his chair, recognizing that Rodriguez's request represented genuine desire for education rather than curiosity about someone whose capabilities had surprised him. The question was whether Ella would be willing to share information that might involve operational security considerations that extended beyond civilian training environments. Ella was quiet for a long moment, studying Rodriguez's expression with the kind of tactical assessment that suggested she was evaluating his motivations and trustworthiness rather than simply considering his request for information. "Before I moved to United States," she said finally, "I worked for organizations that required people to develop capabilities that most military personnel never encountered during conventional training. The specific details aren't important, but the work involved situations where technical precision was measured by mission success rather than by competition scores or training evaluations." Word of what had happened during Martinez's intermediate hand-to-hand combat class spread through Elite Combat Academies network with the speed that marked genuinely significant events. By evening, the story had reached every corner of the facilities. Extended community, carried by conversations that began with technical analysis and evolved into broader discussions about assumptions, respect, and the dangerous gap between appearance and capability. In the facility's main office, receptionist Karen Walsh was fielding phone calls from students who had heard fragments of the story and wanted confirmation about what had actually happened. The calls came from current students, former military personnel who trained at the facility, and law enforcement officers whose agencies used Elite Combat Academy for specialized instruction. "It's true," Walsh found herself saying repeatedly. A student who everyone assumed was a beginner ended up demonstrating professional-level skills during a sparring session. "No, I can't give you specific details about her background, but I can tell you that it opened a lot of eyes about making assumptions based on appearances." The story reached Staff Sergeant Michael Chun at Camp Pendleton through his partner Corporal Santos, who called in during her drive home from the facility. "Mike, you're not going to believe what happened in class today," she began, then spent 20 minutes describing the sparring session that had systematically dismantled every assumption Rodriguez had made about his training partner. "Wait," Chun interrupted. "You're telling me that a Navy SEAL got schooled by someone he thought was a beginner? And she did it without even looking like she was trying?" "More than that," Santos replied. "She made it look effortless. Like she was operating at a completely different level than the rest of us. Martinez thinks she might have some kind of special operations background, but from a different country or organization." Chun was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. As someone who had worked with international military personnel during joint training exercises, he understood that combat expertise came in many forms, and that some of the most effective operators were people whose capabilities weren't immediately obvious to observers, who were looking for familiar markers of military training. At the San Diego Police Department, Sergeant Wilson shared the story with his partner during their evening patrol, describing the way Ella had moved through defensive sequences that neutralized Rodriguez's attacks while setting up counterattacks that demonstrated timing and precision that couldn't be faked or improvised. "The thing that got me," Wilson said as they drove through downtown San Diego, "wasn't just that she was skilled. It was how she handled Rodriguez's disrespect. No anger, no defensiveness, just quiet dignity while he basically told her she didn't belong in the class." His partner, Detective Lisa Park, nodded with recognition. "I've seen that before. People who have real experience don't need to prove anything to anyone. They just do what needs to be done and let the results speak for themselves." The story reached the FBI's San Diego field office through Agent Morrison, who found himself explaining to his supervisor why he was recommending that the Bureau's defensive tactics instructors observe some classes at Elite Combat Academy. "Sir," Morrison said, "I've been training with military personnel for years, and I've never seen technique integration like what this woman demonstrated. If there are people out there with capabilities that we don't understand or recognize, we need to be aware of that for operational planning purposes." By late evening, the story had evolved beyond simple retelling into analysis and discussion about broader implications. In barracks and break rooms, experienced military personnel were sharing their own encounters with individuals whose capabilities had surprised them, and the conversations were revealing patterns that suggested Rodriguez's mistake was more common than anyone wanted to admit. Master Sergeant David Torres, a veteran of multiple special operations deployments, was having dinner with his family when his daughter asked him about a story she had heard from a friend whose father trained at Elite Combat Academy. "Dad, is it true that there are people who are really dangerous, but don't look like what you'd expect?" she asked. Torres set down his fork, recognizing that his daughter's question touched on lessons that extended far beyond martial arts training. "Some of the most capable people I've ever worked with," he said carefully, were people who didn't announce their abilities or demand recognition for their skills. They just did their jobs with professionalism and competence, and you only understood what they were capable of when circumstances required them to demonstrate it. The conversation that followed became a lesson about respect, assumptions, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their appearance or perceived background. At Elite Combat Academy itself, Martinez was working late in his office, updating training protocols and student evaluation procedures based on what had happened during the day's class. The incident with Rodriguez and Ella had highlighted gaps in his screening process that could have resulted in more serious problems. If the situation had escalated differently, he made notes about implementing better initial assessment procedures, creating clearer guidelines about student interactions and mutual respect, and developing training scenarios that would help students recognize their own biases before those biases affected their behavior toward training partners. The phone rang. As he was finishing his documentation, the caller was Colonel Patricia Williams, the director of training at a nearby military installation, who had heard about the incident through the informal networks that connected serious martial arts facilities with military training programs. Martinez, she said without preamble, "I understand you had an interesting class today. A student with undisclosed capabilities who surprised everyone with her skill level." Martinez recognized the tone of someone who was asking questions for official rather than casual reasons. "Yes, ma'am." A situation that provided educational value about assumptions and respect, though it also raised some questions about background verification and security considerations. "I'd like to discuss those questions with you tomorrow," Williams replied. "There are aspects of this situation that might have implications beyond civilian training environments." Rodriguez spent the evening in his apartment staring at the wall, replaying every moment of his interaction with Ella and recognizing patterns in his own behavior that extended far beyond a single training session. The television was on, but he wasn't watching it. His mind was occupied with the uncomfortable process of examining assumptions that he had never questioned and realizing how those assumptions had influenced his treatment of people whose backgrounds he didn't understand. His military training had emphasized the importance of accurate threat assessment and situational awareness, but somewhere along the way he had developed blind spots that allowed him to dismiss people based on superficial characteristics rather than observable capabilities. The recognition was professionally embarrassing and personally humbling. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Martinez's number. The conversation that followed was brief but significant. "Martinez, it's Rodriguez. I wanted to ask if you could give me Ms. Nawakova's contact information. I need to apologize to her properly, outside of the training environment where other people were watching." Martinez was quiet for a moment before responding. "Rodriguez, I appreciate that you want to make amends, but I think you should understand that this situation might be more complex than you realize. Ms. Nawakova's background includes elements that require discretion, and her presence at our facility might involve considerations that extend beyond recreational training." The implications of Martinez's carefully worded response settled over Rodriguez like cold water. If Ella's background involved operational security considerations, then his public dismissal of her capabilities hadn't just been disrespectful, it had been potentially dangerous for reasons that he was only beginning to understand. Meanwhile, across town, Corporal Santos was having dinner with her boyfriend, trying to explain why the day's events had affected her so deeply. "It wasn't just about combat techniques," she said, pushing food around her plate without eating. "It was about watching someone get treated like they didn't belong, and realizing that I didn't do anything to stop it." Her boyfriend, a civilian who worked in software development, struggled to understand why a training incident at a martial arts facility was causing Santos to question her own behavior. "But you didn't do anything wrong," he pointed out. "You weren't the one being disrespectful." "That's exactly the problem," Santos replied. "I saw what was happening. I knew it was wrong. But I stayed silent because it was easier than confronting someone whose approval I wanted to maintain. I prioritized social comfort over doing the right thing. The conversation that followed became a broader discussion about the difference between passive observation and active complicity, and about the responsibility that people had to speak up when they witnessed injustice, even when speaking up was socially uncomfortable. At his home in nearby Chula Vista, Sergeant Wilson was reflecting on similar themes as he helped his teenage son with homework. The day's events had reminded him of incidents from his own law enforcement career where he had made assumptions about people based on their appearance or background, assumptions that had sometimes led to mistakes that could have had serious consequences. "Dad," his son asked, looking up from his mathematics textbook, "you seem distracted tonight. Is everything okay?" Wilson set down the cup of coffee he had been holding without drinking and looked at his son with the expression of someone who had just learned an important lesson about the gap between intention and behavior. "I learned something today about respect and assumptions," he said. "About how easy it is to treat people badly when you think you know more about them than you actually do." The conversation that followed became an impromptu lesson about the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their appearance or perceived background, and about the difference between earned respect and basic human courtesy that should be automatic. Agent Morrison was having a similar conversation with his wife, describing the way Ella had absorbed Rodriguez's dismissive treatment without defending herself or demonstrating any of the emotional reactions that might have been expected from someone being publicly humiliated. "She just stood there," Morrison said, taking criticism from someone who had no idea what he was talking about. "And she did it with more dignity than I would have shown in the same situation." His wife, a social worker who had spent years working with people whose capabilities were often underestimated by others, nodded with recognition. Some people learn early that defending themselves against assumptions is less effective than simply demonstrating competence when the opportunity arises. It sounds like she was waiting for the right moment to show who she really was. The insight resonated with Morrison as he thought about his own professional experience with individuals whose backgrounds included elements that weren't immediately apparent to observers who were looking for familiar markers of training or capability. Back at Elite Combat Academy, Martinez was working late in his office, reviewing security footage from the day's classes and making notes about policy changes that would prevent similar situations from developing in the future. The footage showed the entire interaction between Rodriguez and Ella, from the initial assignment of training partners through the sparring demonstration that had revealed the gap between assumptions and reality. Watching the footage with the benefit of hindsight, Martinez could see subtle indicators that should have suggested Ella's background was more complex than her registration paperwork indicated. Her movement patterns during warm-up exercises, her body language during technique demonstrations, and her controlled responses to Rodriguez's increasingly dismissive treatment all carried signs that someone with more experience might have recognized. He made notes about implementing better initial assessment procedures and creating training scenarios that would help instructors and students recognize their own biases before those biases affected their interactions with training partners whose backgrounds they didn't fully understand. The phone rang as he was finishing his documentation. The caller was Ella herself, her accented voice carrying the same controlled courtesy that had characterized her behavior throughout the day's events. "Mr. Martinez," she said, "I wanted to thank you for allowing the situation to develop as it did today. Sometimes people need to encounter the consequences of their assumptions before they can recognize why those assumptions are problematic." Martinez recognized that her call represented more than simple courtesy. "Ms. Nowakova, I have to ask, was today's demonstration something you had planned, or did it develop spontaneously based on Rodriguez's behavior?" Ella was quiet for a moment before responding. "Let's say that I recognized an educational opportunity and decided to participate in it. Sometimes the best lessons are the ones that people teach themselves through experience rather than instruction. 3 months later, Elite Combat Academy had become known throughout San Diego's military and law enforcement community, not just for its technical instruction, but for its emphasis on respect and the recognition that competence came in many forms. The story of Rodriguez and Ella had evolved from a single training incident into a foundational lesson about assumptions, dignity, and the importance of treating everyone with the courtesy they deserved as human beings, rather than the respect they had to earn through demonstration. Martinez had implemented new protocols that began each class with a brief discussion about mutual respect and the dangers of making assumptions about training partners based on appearance or perceived background. The protocols weren't presented as response to a specific incident, but as fundamental principles that made effective learning possible in environments where people from diverse backgrounds came together to develop dangerous skills. Rodriguez had become one of the facility's most effective advocates for these principles, sharing his own experience as a cautionary tale about the gap between self-perception and actual behavior. His transformation from someone who dismissed others based on assumptions to someone who actively promoted inclusive training environments had made him a more effective instructor and a better training partner for students whose backgrounds differed from his own. The hardest thing to admit, he told new students during orientation sessions, is that you can be wrong about people in ways that reveal more about your own limitations than about their capabilities. The woman who taught me that lesson did it without ever raising her voice or defending herself. She just waited for the right moment to show everyone who she really was. Ella continued to train at Elite Combat Academy, though her presence had evolved from that of a presumed beginner to that of an advanced practitioner whose technical knowledge benefited everyone who worked with her. She never discussed the specific details of her background, but her approach to training and her interactions with other students demonstrated principles that extended far beyond martial arts technique. Her influence on the facility's culture was subtle but profound. Students learned to evaluate their training partners based on observable capabilities rather than superficial characteristics, and to offer assistance and encouragement rather than criticism and dismissal when working with people whose skill levels were still developing. The story had also reached military installations throughout Southern California, where it was used in leadership training programs to illustrate the importance of accurate assessment and the dangers of allowing personal biases to compromise professional judgment. Staff Sergeant Chun included it in his diversity and inclusion briefings at Camp Pendleton, using it to demonstrate how assumptions about capability could undermine unit effectiveness and operational security. The lesson isn't just about being nice to people, Chun would tell his Marines. It's about understanding that threat assessment and capability evaluation require objective observation rather than reliance on stereotypes or preconceived notions. In operational environments, those kinds of assumptions can get people killed. Colonel Williams had met with Martinez several times to discuss the broader implications of the incident, particularly as they related to security considerations in civilian training environments. Their conversations had led to improved coordination between military installations and private facilities that provided combat training to personnel whose backgrounds included classified elements. "What happened in your facility," Williams told Martinez during one of their meetings, "illustrates why we need better protocols for managing the intersection between operational security and civilian training environments. Not everyone who looks like a recreational student is actually a recreational student, and we need systems that account for that reality." At the San Diego Police Department, Sergeant Wilson had incorporated the story into his training of new officers, using it to illustrate the importance of treating everyone with professional courtesy, regardless of their appearance or perceived background. "Police work," he would tell academy recruits, "requires you to make quick assessments about people's intentions and capabilities. But those assessments need to be based on observable behavior rather than assumptions about what dangerous people look like. The most capable individuals are often the ones who don't need to announce their capabilities. The story had also influenced training protocols at the FBI San Diego field office, where Agent Morrison had worked with instructors to develop scenarios that challenged agents' preconceptions about threat assessment and situational awareness. The woman in this story, Morrison explained to his colleagues, demonstrated that competence and capability don't always look like what we expect them to look like. As federal agents, we need to be aware that our own biases can compromise our ability to accurately evaluate the people we encounter during investigations. But perhaps the most important impact of the story was on the individual people who had witnessed or heard about the events that Tuesday morning at Elite Combat Academy. Rodriguez's transformation from someone who dismissed others based on assumptions to someone who actively promoted inclusive environments had inspired similar self-examination among his peers and colleagues. Santos had become an advocate for speaking up when she witnessed disrespectful behavior, recognizing that silence in the face of injustice was a form of complicity that she was no longer willing to accept. Wilson had improved his interactions with community members whose backgrounds he didn't understand, treating everyone with the professional courtesy that his training had always demanded, but that his assumptions had sometimes prevented him from providing. The ripple effects continued to spread through interconnected networks of military personnel, law enforcement officers, and civilian martial artists who understood that the principles illustrated by Ella's quiet dignity and Rodriguez's eventual recognition of error applied to situations that extended far beyond training facilities and sparring sessions. In the end, the story of the European woman who had been dismissed as a beginner until she demonstrated capabilities that challenged everyone's assumptions had become more than just an anecdote about martial arts training. It had become a reminder that respect was not something that people had to earn through demonstration of their worth, but something that should be offered automatically as recognition of their inherent dignity as human beings. And in a world where assumptions about capability and worth were often based on superficial characteristics rather than actual knowledge, that reminder had proven to be more valuable than any technical instruction or combat technique that could be learned in a converted warehouse in San Diego, where people gathered to prepare for situations that required both physical skills and the wisdom to use those skills appropriately. The lesson was simple, but its applications were universal. Respect everyone until they prove they don't deserve it, rather than withholding respect until people prove they do deserve it. Everything else was just details. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.